folks that have joined us this evening for this informational Zoom on the Lovejoy VATRE. As you may know, we are having a voter-approved tax ratification election that'll go in front of the voters on November 8th. And early voting is fast approaching because that begins on October 24th. The first thing that we would like to begin with is our district profile so that we can set the context. As a school district, we have 4,219 students, and that is a decreasing number as compared to last school year. Last school year, we had about 4,334 students, so we're slightly declining in enrollment. This year we have about 520 employees. Last year we had about 600 employees. That reduction was intentional to reduce those number of employees to come in alignment with our funding. We're very proud of the progress that we have made in that area, and we were able to do that without a formal reduction in force. We have 6 campuses: an early childhood development center that serves infants through 5-year-olds. And then we have 2 elementary campuses, Hart and Puster. We have an intermediate school, Sloan Creek Intermediate School, Willow Springs Middle School, and of course, Lovejoy High School. We were founded in 1917, and 2010 was our very first graduating class, which is really shocking to me sometimes because our high school already has some pretty proud and rich traditions that our students and our staff celebrate. And of course, we are here to make sure we are propelling each and every person to personal excellence. That means each and every one of our students and each and every one of our staff members. We want to make sure that we are honoring and acting in alignment with our core values in everything that we do. First and foremost, putting kids first, making student-centered decisions, that we are one heart, one Lovejoy, that we are focused on relationships, community, and connection, and that we are our best today, better tomorrow, and have that continuous improvement mindset. This is some information about our school district. We're very proud of the significant accomplishments of our students and of our staff with the tremendous support of our parents. We were very excited to recently find out that we were the top ranked traditional school district in Texas and received an A rating from the Texas Education Agency. Our students worked really, really hard for that. We also recently received news, and it's not on this list, that as far as the niche 2023 rankings, that we have the #1 teachers in North Texas, and we're the #1 school district in Collin County. So our kids have worked very, very hard, and we're very proud of everything that they are doing academically, athletically, and in fine arts. I am going to hand it over to Dr. DuPlessis, and she is going to take us into some school funding Finance 101.
Thank you, Ms. Kordel. So we wanted to start this presentation with some basic information about how school finance works. Has some similarities, but also some differences with private sector financing. So first, we're going to talk about the school funding buckets. Essentially, school districts we get our funding from 2 sources. One is M&O, or maintenance and operations, and the other is INS, which is interest and sinking. And so these are the 2 funding buckets with which we operate. So M&O is like your maintenance and operational funds for any other entity where you're paying for salaries and supplies and benefits and utilities and all those types of things. The INS fund is used for construction and paying off facilities and capital projects and debt service. So they're 2 separate buckets, and oftentimes when we start talking about a vote, people might be more familiar with a bond issue, which is put forth to the voters to consider something like a building or facilities or capital work that would be on the INS side. This is a voter-approved tax rate election that would only impact the M&O side. It doesn't have anything to do with building new facilities. It's really for operational funds. So you'll see on the right-hand side that any of the funding that we do receive via the VATRE would 100% be used for operation of the school district. So of those funding sources, we primarily have three main funding sources that we receive, and each district in the state of Texas has a bit of a different makeup of how much they receive from each of these sources. So those are local school district property taxes, state funds, and federal funds. For Lovejoy ISD for the current year, we should receive about 85% of our funding from local school district property taxes. We receive about 12% from state and 1% from federal. Because we're considered a property wealthy district, we do receive the primary source of our funding from local property taxes. We receive a smaller amount because of the state funding formula, which reduces state funding when local funding is higher. We don't receive very much in federal funding because we don't have a high number of economically disadvantaged students, which a lot of federal funding is based upon. So we receive about 1% from federal funds. We're also subject to recapture because of that designation as a property wealthy district. We send back about 2% of that total revenue, which is a much smaller percentage compared to some of our local peers, but is a factor in our funding. If we look at that makeup without the VATRE versus with the VATRE, you will see on the right that the percentage basis of that breakdown doesn't change. Of course, the dollar values change a bit, but on a percentage basis, that breakdown is essentially the same with or without the VATRE. So we have made a number of efforts in the past year, especially in regard to financial sustainability. So we wanted to share some of those measures that have been taken in the past year. So this is a projection that we've been working on for quite some time and kind of modifying and rebuilding as we were looking towards the budget for this current school year. So this is a baseline projection. It shows you the prior year, 2021, the current year at the time that we were looking at, which was 21-22, the year we're in now, 22-23, and the 3 subsequent years after that. A lot of the items that we're looking at, we kind of highlighted some things that are really important. Coming out of fiscal year 21, we had over a $500,000 deficit in the budget, and that depleted our fund balance down to 74 days of operating expenses. This presented quite a challenge going into last year, into fiscal year 22. So a lot of effort was made, and we'll share some of those details here shortly. But a lot of gain had to be made because 74 days of operating expense presents a significant challenge to the district in meeting our payables. The end of the year last year, we estimated a net surplus of $1.8 million. So we did a lot of recovery and ended up to the positive by that much compared to the adopted budget, which put us at about 93 days of fund balance at the end of fiscal year. And all this will be finalized with our auditor here shortly. But we're very pleased with that outcome. But we also wanted to be forward looking and build a multi-year projection that would show us what the state funding formula would result in for Lovejoy ISD based on updated demographic projections that we had done. So you can see from the rest of the years that are presented that we have only built in the demographic projections that we have gotten updated. We also included a 2% increase in salary year over year for the future years. And that's just an assumption to build into the model to see what happens. That's not a guarantee or a state mandate or anything like that. But we also built in the property value increase that we have traditionally seen of about 8% in the out years. So that's really all that's built into this projection, but we wanted to see what it would do for the district. So you can see based on where we were that in fiscal year 26, that's 3 years away, we would be at an annual deficit for that year of over $2.1 million and down to 65 days of operating expense at the end of that year. We know that that would be extremely problematic because in 21-22, in about December, we were very much closely watching our collections for tax receipts because we rely so heavily on those. There was a significant concern that if they did not come in on time, we would be having to look at another measure to meet our payroll and payable expense in December. And so that could be a loan, it could be a number of other measures, but We were very close to that. We did not have to do that, but we know in the projection for fiscal year 26, we would. So the next projection that you'll see is that same, all the same information that we built that prior baseline on projection on with the VATRE. So if the VATRE were to be approved by the voters with the 3.17 cent increase to the tax rate for the school district compared to what it would be without, you can see the change in those out 3 years. By fiscal year 26, we would still have a deficit of a little under $1.6 million, much less significant on an annual basis, but that would also leave us ending that year with 80 days of fund balance. And we know based on what happened in 2021 that we could get through the year, we could meet our payables, and we would be, in a much better position with that additional revenue from a financial perspective.
We wanted to share a little bit of how we got here and our 22-23 budget assessment journey. So last school year, we started with an assessment of our current state. We needed to understand exactly where we were to be able to determine where we needed to go. So we began with a staffing efficiency study. This was a study that was done in partnership with a third party who has access to staffing data throughout the state so that we could look at our staffing and making sure that our staffing allocations were set up to make sure we were effective, but that we were also efficient. That information was very important in helping us build our 22-23 staffing model and our budget. We also engaged in a updated demographic study, which was very important because the district had done this in 2019, but a lot has changed since COVID. And some of the typical growth patterns that districts have seen were certainly disrupted. And this demographic study was extremely important to understanding our current state and then understanding what we needed to do to adjust and plan for the future. And I'm very proud to say that our demographic study, I think we are actually 9 students over what we estimated based on that study and what we determined for our 22-23 budget. So we did a very accurate job, and that information was critical to that process. We also engaged in a program review process to make sure, again, that we were operating effectively and efficiently in our delivery of services to our students. And then zero-based budgeting was an important part of what we did. Typically, school districts roll their budgets forward each year and then make adjustments up or down based on what the needs are. We did not do that. We zeroed everything out, and everyone who was a budget manager, which includes our principals, directors, executive directors, we asked them to identify a list of needs and then prioritize those needs. And then our finance department did a great job of providing leadership and guiding our budget managers through that. And at the end of that process, we saved an additional $300,000 from our maintenance and operations budget. That is something we're very proud of because those budgets had actually the year prior already been cut 15%. So the fact that we were able to get an additional $300,000 in efficiency was excellent. We also engaged in a capacity assessment with the closing of Lovejoy Elementary in the spring of 2021. There were some questions about our elementary schools and then really even our schools at the secondary level and what our capacity was to be able to handle the number of students we have. And so we took that capacity assessment and aligned it with that demographic study, and we're pleased to find out that we have the room we need to make sure and the space we need to make sure we're educating our students moving forward. Our board identified 4 priorities throughout this process. The first one was fund balance, knowing that we need to keep the lights on and pay payroll each month. And as Jennifer said, we get to a point in the school year at the beginning where we're floating between the beginning of the school year when we start having to pay salaries and then when those tax collections come in. So that fund balance was critically important. And then compensation compensation as well. We are paying for teaching excellence, and we want the best possible teachers and staff to serve our students and keep the legacy of excellence that we have in Lovejoy ISD. And then attendance enrollment, because attendance enrollment are how we are funded. We also engaged in a stakeholder-based financial sustainability committee process where we brought stakeholders in to look at our financial current state and help us in strategizing and planning for the future. That financial sustainability committee had 40 stakeholders on it. It included parents, community members, teachers, campus administrators, and central office administrators. We had 6 meetings together, and this group spent over 450 hours engaged in this process, for which we are so grateful, because there is a lot of other things that they could have done with their time. And in that process, they identified 4 budget priorities: revenue generation, efficiency measures, program analysis, and legacy of excellence. You see a lot of Post-it notes there. It would be interesting if we counted up the number of Post-it notes we went through in this process. But those Post-it notes really represent the thinking of our parents, community members, and staff. So when they came into the room, they were given a blank stack of Post-it notes and told, put anything you want on these Post-it notes in regard to school finance and Lovejoy ISD finance. One thought per Post-it note. And they went through that process, and some people had 50, 60 Post-it notes in front of them. And then they went through a process of organizing those into categories. And throughout this process, they identified the areas that they wanted to focus on. And it really led to some very rich conversation. And what I'm very proud of is that we did not wait until the end of the process to start implementing things. If there was a great idea on the table, if it was something we could implement immediately, it was something that we went back as a leadership team and utilized immediately to positively impact our budget. And you'll see that impact here. So I'll let Jennifer talk a little bit more about this in a minute. But a part of that impact was beginning last school year, as we would have resignations or retirements, we would analyze whether that was a position that was essential to fill and replace, or if it was a position that we could absorb through a reorganization restructuring process. And we did that quite a bit. And then at the end of the school year, we used some of the attrition to right size our staffing based on our student enrollment and our funding. And in that process, we saved $1.3 million, and over 600,000 of that was actually from central office. So Jennifer, I'll let you take it away on the rest.
All right. So we also, in addition to the decreases in expenditures from the staffing efficiencies, the zero-based budgeting, and the other cost savings projects, whether that was looking at utility savings or overtime savings, lots of different things there. We also had some increases in revenues. So we had several grant awards that were significant. One, probably the most significant, was the Lovejoy Child Development Center. We were eligible for some grant funding from the Texas Workforce Commission for their work there. That was very beneficial. And then we did some special grants for school health, dyslexia, several of those areas, so that we could use that special funding and offset some of the expenses we may have had otherwise. In addition to that, we reviewed the Lovejoy Scholar Program. So in last year, we did not charge tuition in an effort to increase enrollment. But as we reviewed the results of that change, we realized that if we reinstated some type of tuition program, we would likely make more revenue in that way. So the changes in the Lovejoy Scholar Program, reinstating tuition with a lowered rate for returning scholars, will result this year in an additional revenue of over $1 million. And then the last item that was identified was consideration for the VATRE, which when we analyzed that, would calculate out to about a $640,000 net revenue increase for the district. So in May of of this year, 2022, the Financial Sustainability Committee presented their recommendations to the Board of Trustees, and they submitted their recommendations on each of those 4 areas that were highlighted. What you see on the right is a snip of the actual strategic scorecard that was developed by the Revenue Generation subgroup of the Financial Sustainability Committee. And you can see their strategic target on the upper right that we will focus on generating revenue increases in order to achieve financial sustainability. And the first strategy that they identified towards achieving that strategic target was to consider a VATRE as a means to facilitate financial sustainability. And so all of these strategies are being implemented or reviewed. But that was the first strategy that they identified to generate significant revenue. In August, the board is required to adopt the tax rate for the coming year. And so the board opted to exercise the recommendation of the Financial Sustainability Committee and adopt a rate that included the 3.17 additional cents on the tax rate and called for the VATRE. So what is a voter-approved tax rate election? It is state law requires that to increase that rate, an election does have to be performed by the district, and it is required to be done on the uniform election date. So on the left here, you'll see the annual tax rate each year for Lovejoy ISD. You'll see the red bar is the M&O tax rate. The gray bar is the INS tax rate. You'll see that red bar shrinking each year. It actually shrinks if we consider going all the way back 20 years, it decreases each year. So in 22-23, you'll see the rates information there. In 21, our tax rate was $1.50.50. In 22, this year, it will either be $1.4746 if the voter approved tax rate election is passed by the voters, or it will be $1.4429 if the voters do not approve the tax rate election. So either way, the rate will be reduced from the prior year. It's just a matter of how much it would be reduced and if the district would receive that additional revenue via the VATRE or not. So the district has identified the financial priorities that we want to target. Number one is employee compensation. We know that's so important to maintaining our legacy of excellence. And then the second is restoring the fund balance, because we also know that financial sustainability is an important part of keeping that legacy of excellence as well. So these are the two financial priorities, employee compensation and restoring the fund balance, that we're continuing to focus on in all that we do, including the VATRE consideration. So last year, we did a compensation assessment for all positions in the district. At that time, we did review teacher salaries for every 5-year increment. We identified any positions in the district that were 5% or more out of market, and at that time, none of our teacher 5-year increments were. However, a lot changed over the summer as teachers exited the profession, and many districts had extra funding via ESSER, which Lovejoy ISD did not receive very much of at all, or districts had healthy fund balances and chose to adopt deficit budgets in order to use some of that fund balance to provide for larger compensation amounts so that they could attract the teachers that they needed in their districts. So you can see the results of that here. This is the current school year teacher pay comparison by 5-year increments with those neighboring and peer districts. And so we definitely don't want to see Lovejoy ISD at the bottom from a competitive hiring perspective. And the reason that payroll is such a driver in our financial outlook is because 83% of our expenditure budget is for payroll and benefits. You'll see very small amounts left over after that 83%. 9% is utilities and contracted services, which is essentially running and keeping the lights on. Supplies and materials are 5%. So very little else outside of payroll for the expenditure budget. On the right-hand side, you'll see the breakdown of that payroll and benefits budget and where each is going to. So 66% of that payroll is related to direct instruction and related services, 12% for student support services like school counselors and LSSPs, 9% is operation support like security and technology. School and instructional leadership is 7%. Administrative support services is only 4% of that total. So if we look at the cost of increasing employee compensation to the district budget, we can see here the changes from a 1% increase, with the red bar being for teachers, librarians, and nurses, and the gray bar being for all other staff. And you can see 1% on the left to 5% on the right. A 2% payroll increase across the board for the district is $644,000 in increased expenditures. A 4% payroll increase is almost $1.3 million. So in addition to focusing on compensation, the reason that we're also talking about fund balance is because it is essential to continually operating the district. Fund balance is kind of like a school district savings account. And so really where we get a lot of our guidelines is from GFOA, which provides a lot of those guidelines for governmental accounting. And they suggest that you start with 90 days as a minimum to your fund balance and consider increasing that based on the fluctuation in your cash flow. And we'll share a little bit more here in a moment about our cash flow, but our cash flow does fluctuate significantly from month to month. So in that case, the recommendation would be to increase that number of days of fund balance to something like 120 or even 150 days. So as we shared in the projection earlier, for our district in 2026 and 3 years without a VATRE, our fund balance would be 65 days. With the VATRE, it would be 80 days. So you can see the difference in where we are compared to the benchmarks. What you see here is a demonstration of our cash on hand, cash in, cash out each month of the school year. So this is our 22-23 projection. And you'll see what occurs in terms of cash for us. We receive more of our cash when the tax collections begin to come in towards the end of December and beginning of January. Until then, we have to start the school year ensuring that we're paying payroll, we're purchasing supplies, we're preparing everything that we need for students, but we're not receiving very much of that cash in. And that's why that fund balance is so important. We're projected in this November to get down to 29 days of cash on hand, which is a low level. So that's why we're continuing to look at this and improvements we want to make for financial sustainability. So the potential VATRE outcomes, when we're looking at the election, of course, the focus for the VATRE is those two priorities, employee compensation and restoring the fund balance. So a vote for the VATRE would result in that increase of $640,000 in net revenue. A vote against the VATRE would require the district to go back to the drawing board and look at some additional substantial changes that we can make in terms of either revenue increases via things like fees or things like that, or reductions in expenditures, whether that's from programs or people. And so those are kind of the options that the district would have. In terms of the VATRE's impact on property owners in the district, there are a number of factors that affect our tax bill. And so the effects that decrease the tax bill are listed on the left. Primarily, tax rate compression has an impact, and we're seeing that again this year. This year, we also have a homestead exemption increase that was passed by the voters in May from $25,000 to $40,000, lowering your taxable value and therefore lowering the bill. You may have other qualifying exemptions as well that can lower your tax bill. On the increasing side, the most significant increase to our tax bill this year is the increase in taxable property value. Most of our homesteaders are exempted at a cap over 10%, but that's still usually the most substantial increase to a tax bill. If you had major renovations or additions, that could also be a substantial increase. And then the VATRE would increase the tax bill relative to what it would be without the VATRE. And you can see that impact for the average taxable property value, which in Lovejoy ISD for 2022 is $675,420. The annual VATRE impact on that home would be $201. So the chart at the upper right also shows you that impact for various levels of home value. So taxable property value of $1 million would result in an annual difference of $304 with or without the VATRE. So these two scenarios just give kind of a comparison of those other factors. So in example one, this is the average property value in Lovejoy ISD of $675,420. That homeowner would have an annual tax bill of about $9,370. The homestead exemption savings they would receive this year compared to last year would be about $221. The VATRE difference would be an increase of about $201. So the offset of just those two factors for that homeowner would be a decrease of $20. Of course, the property values have increased, so that portion of the bill would probably have maybe an $800 or $900 increase on that portion of the tax bill. For example number two, for $1 million valued home, the annual tax bill is about $14,156. The homestead exemption would save them the same $221. The VATRE would have a relative impact of a $304 increase. So their offset just with the homestead exemption of VATRE would be an increase of $83. So the good news for anybody who's online who is over 65 is the VATRE should not impact your tax rate or your tax bill if you have received the exemptions or the ceiling for being over 65. At that point, the school district tax amount shouldn't increase in the future. So it would not increase with an increase in values or with the tax rate election. So we did want to share some information about the election and what that will look like. So the first item here is sample ballot language. We know when we go to vote, sometimes there's language that can be a little bit confusing. So we wanted to share this with you. The ballot will show the VATRE as Proposition A. That's how it will be stated. And the actual ballot language is snipped and there on the right hand of the slide. The actual language will read, ratifying the ad valorem tax rate of $1.4746 per $100 valuation in Lovejoy Independent School District for the current year, a rate that will result in an increase of 13.32% in maintenance and operations tax revenue for the district for the current year as compared to the preceding year, which is an additional $3,158,032. The for box would be a vote for the VATRE. The against would be against that tax rate election. So to break this down a bit, we get a lot of questions like, what is an ad valorem tax rate? Ad valorem simply means it's property taxes that we're collecting locally. The language says something about raising the tax rate. Really, as we said before, last year's rate was $1.5050. So even at the $1.4746 with the VATRE, it's a 3.04 cent decrease from last year. The gross tax collections that the district would receive as a result of the VATRE is $775,000, and about $640,000 of that $775,000 is what the district would be able to retain. So a lot of questions are, where is this $3.1 million figure coming from? That revenue increase is related to calculating the no new revenue tax rate. It doesn't consider the state funding formula for school districts that tells us how much of our tax collections that we get to maintain. The no new revenue tax rate is essentially comparing last year's collections to this year's collections and calculating that property value change. However, the state funding formula dictates based on our attendance and based on all the state funding formulas, how much of that we receive. So the no new revenue tax rate probably makes sense when you're looking at things like perhaps a hospital district or a city or a county. But for school districts, we're subject to that state funding formula. So we would not receive the 3.1 million. We would receive the 775 and maintain the 640,000. If the no new revenue tax rate were adopted by the district in 22-23, we would actually lose $2 million in net revenue. So you can kind of see the relative difference there with that no new revenue tax rate and why that language might be a little bit confusing for a school district VATRE.
We've got some election details for you. As I said earlier, early voting begins on October 24th, which is fast approaching. And then, of course, Election Day is November 8th. The Collin County Elections Department will release information on specific polling locations. Polling locations will be open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And we will also advertise that information for people's convenience as well. And we wanted to open it up for any questions you may have at this portion of the presentation. Feel free to use the chat, or you can just unmute and ask us anything that you have on your mind or anything you need clarification on. Well, I'm going to start throwing out some common questions that we've received. Jennifer, would you be able to address the reason why it could not be more than 3.17 cents, how it got to be that 3.17 cents?
That's a good question that we've received because 3.17 sounds a little bit exact. So the legislature sets forth how much that the district can add to the tax rate. So 3.17 cents represents the cap at which the district can't increase the tax rate any further. So this would be the amount that we can go for unless in the future the legislature changes something.
And Jennifer, we've also had a couple questions about tax compression. Some people have asked what it is and how it impacts that tax rate.
Yes. So tax rate compression has been passed by the legislature and is calculated by the state each year. So recognizing that property values are increasing and therefore the tax burden for homeowners and other tax-paying entities is increasing, they provided for compressing the tax rate, which would lower the bill to some extent. In our area, the increasing values far exceed the tax rate compression amount, but it does assist with lowering the tax bill.
Thank you for answering that. All right, we've got one. The question is, hi, Katie and team. I have a question on how the 775K is calculated. I see the state taxable value of 3.6 million, applying that to the 3.17 cent tax rate that comes out to $1,157,329. Seemingly, we would be losing a hefty percentage of that if we only retain 640K.
That's a good question. So the actual amount that would be generated by the 3.17 cents is the $775,000 in increased collections. So we could kind of go offline and talk through how that formula works, but there's taxable value and then there's collections. And so there's factors like the collection rate and things like that that go into that. But essentially the collections we would receive as an increase would be the 775. And then the amount that we would send back, to your point, is not the difference between 640 and the 1.1 you mentioned, but it's actually the difference between the 640 and the 775. So we would definitely, based on that, be keeping a large majority of the funding received from the VATRE.
Can I also add that there is a difference between the taxable value and when you break it out as far as the freeze adjusted And then because the over 65 is frozen, so the 3.17 is not applied to the total 3.6 million.
Thank you for adding that. Good question.
People should be warned that we were professionally trained on wait time, right? We go to workshops for that. We want to make sure that everyone that is on knows that we are available. If you've got individual questions, do not hesitate to email, call, reach out. We want to make sure that you have the information you need to go out and vote. You will notice that the information we shared was informational. The district by law needs to take a neutral stance, and that's where we very much want to be and respect you as a voter. And as we respect you as a voter, again, we want to make sure you have the information that you need. So again, if you need more information, you need clarification, do not hesitate to reach out, and also do not hesitate to point community members in our direction as well. We have a pretty comprehensive VATRE informational website posted. You can get to that from the main page of our website. It also has a frequently asked questions section that we continue to add to as we get great questions from our community. Dr. DuPlessis, anything else for the good of the group?
I don't think so, but thank you for attending.
Yes, thank you all for giving up your personal time to come and find out more. Have a great evening.